Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons, one of the vice presidents at the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem and our senior spokesman. And it's good to have you on this week's show. Thanks for tuning in. And I'm coming to you this week, not from our headquarters in Jerusalem, but from West London, where I'm being hosted actually by today's guest, Simon Barrett. And Simon is a TV presenter on Christian TV, Revelation TV here in the UK, has a show called The Middle East Report. He's been a good friend for a while. He was on a solidarity mission with us back in January, February to Israel. And first of all, Simon, thanks for being with us and thanks for hosting me on a speaking tour.
It's an absolute pleasure, and it's great that you can be in my basement as well as you unpack the latest developments happening in Israel and the Middle East.
Yes, and I've been on a speaking tour here in the UK this week, very fantastic results. But today we're dealing with what we're now sort of restyling. It was the Gaza war, but it's now the Israel-Iran war because it's this exchange. Iran firing about 10 days ago or so over 350 missiles and drones at Israel. And Israel, we'll talk about Israel's response, very limited, a couple drones that it looked like you could have probably got them at Walmart, and then some missiles, air-to-surface missiles with stealth capabilities. But we'll talk about the results of that and the implications. But before we get to Simon, I just want to give an update on some of the other developments. And we'll talk to Simon, especially about what's happening in the UK concerning Israel, because I've had a real education myself this week about it, but we'll get to that. But first, we're at 200 days of the war between Israel and Hamas, and now a direct confrontation. The shadow war that's been going on for several decades between Israel and Iran is out in the open. But it's also this week, it's been Passover starting on Monday night. And I think Israel, it's not such a lull in the fighting. I think the intensity of the conflict in Gaza has gone down some, but because of the Passover, there is people are trying to take a little bit of a break from the war. And of course, this Passover was different. They ask the question at Passover, why is this night different than any other night? Well, why is this Passover different? And it's because there's still around 130 hostages, Israelis held in Gaza by Hamas. And there was a lot of effort to try and get them out by Passover in some sort of hostage exchange deal with Hamas. Hamas wasn't having it. They didn't want to play the game. They were trying, Israel, along with the US and Egypt especially, were trying to get at least 40 hostages out over by Passover or during Passover, releasing one a day over like a 42-day, a 6-week truce, a break in the fighting. But it may be, some are speculating. Of course, there's no hard proof one way or the other, but some were speculating very, it's not such good news that there may not even be 40 hostages alive to exchange. It was supposed to be the last of the women, around 19, 20 of those, and some elderly folks. They've got people in their 80s still holding hostage. It's horrible. And some of the people who were sick and had serious health problems. But Hamas didn't want to pitch. And they actually just right at Passover, they released a video of one of the hostages, Hirsch Goldman, Poland. He talked about that it was getting close to 200 days. So it seems like it is a recent video for his family. At least it's proof of life, but it's also just adds to the whole trauma that there he is, he's alive, but he's in torment. He said he's in hell and was urging the government to do something to get him out of it. And you could see he was the hostage that had his lower arm from the elbow down blown off in by grenade, and while a bunch of people were hiding in a bomb shelter along the highway there near the music festival. We've heard from his mother, Rachel Goldberg, 3 times. She's spoken to 3 different solidarity missions that we brought to Israel. She's quite a star herself. She's been on the cover of Time magazine. Amazing, calm, and probably the most effective spokesperson of all the families of the hostages, and you get really attached to her. We've been praying for her, prayed for her directly. She's a woman of faith. So, this gets kind of personal when you've met Hirsch's mother 3 times. But that's the update on the hostages over Passover. People at Jewish people and others who observed the Passover Seder meal Monday night kept a seat open for a hostage symbolically, and they actually took a 5th cup of wine. You usually have 4 during the Passover meal. They took a 5th as a prayer and a gesture towards the hostages. The fighting in Gaza has been much less than over recent months. The IDF says it's in phase 3, where it's targeted operations. They don't want to leave substantial forces inside Gaza, where they'd be subject to ambushes, guerrilla type warfare. So they pulled most of the troops out. They do have the strip still divided, and everyone's preparing for this operation in Gaza. In Rafah at the southern end, where they say there's 4 Hamas brigades there and some other terror infrastructure and tunnels along the border they want to get out. Of course, it's a sensitive move because of all the 1 million or so displaced civilians from Gaza are all huddling along at Rafah along the border with Egypt. You're closer to the food that's been coming in, and you're close to that border. If it's ever breached, everyone would make a breakaway to go elsewhere. But the IDF says it will take around 6 weeks to carry out the Rafah operation, including the time to evacuate all the civilians. Once that starts, the operation is close. And there's satellite images in recent days of Israel setting up big tent camps back in Khan Yunis, where they've just finished fighting Hamas there. And there's been a lot of food aid coming in. Actually, some interesting photos and footage of a lot of Gazans swimming in the Mediterranean, enjoying the beaches with all the food and people swimming in the Med. This story of all the suffering in Gaza has been severely undermined. I still would rather be on the Israel side of the Gaza border than in Gaza, but it's not as bad as many were saying, and the IDF has called up 2 reservist brigades getting ready for this, and may even evacuate people any day now before the Passover week is over. We'll see how that goes. In the north, there's still daily exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah. A lot of damage on both sides of the border. In Israel, some of the border towns have been taking a lot of damage, and in South Lebanon, if Israel does decide to go into Lebanon to take out Hezbollah's capabilities, I don't think the air campaign, Western doctrine says you start with an air campaign, soften the defenses. That's already been done to a large extent, and they could probably go quickly to a ground operation. But the IDF claims, I think it was Defense Minister Gantz has just claimed that they've taken out at least half of the commanders of Hezbollah there in the southern area below the Litani River. So they've already done a lot of damage. Some good news from the U.S. Congress passed the aid package for Israel and Ukraine, and even for humanitarian aid for Gaza. and it included 17 billion in military aid for Israel, mainly military aid. I think the Senate version had 14 billion, so the House has passed a larger amount, and that quickly got reconciled between the two houses. I think Biden has already signed it into law, so that money will be, it'll take a while to get it all here, but a lot of that is to restore Israel's interceptors for Iron Dome and such. The Arrow 3 to rebuild the arsenal of interceptor missiles, but other things. But the bad news out of the U.S. is all these campus protests that at Columbia University, I think it's at Yale, latest reports at University of Texas in Austin. So Texas as a whole is a conservative state, very Republican, a lot of new Hispanics and others in there. So, there's the Democrats are getting more votes, but Austin is a sort of a stronghold of liberals in Texas, and especially at the University of Texas, and there's students protesting there, and also University of South Carolina, Southern California. It's spreading all across the country, where it's just not Muslims, it's Native Americans who are going and occupying different buildings or setting up encampments, tent camps, to protest against Israel. A lot of it is to call for divestment and arms embargoes. They want to deny Israel the right of self-defense. I think it's a little modeled on the old Vietnam the Vietnam War protests, where they would occupy the president's office or whatever of the university. And Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, just compared that to the German universities in the 1930s. And I think it's an appropriate analogy. A lot of these kids, they're out there chanting from the river to the seas, Palestine can be free. They're at Columbia and Harvard and all these schools, and they can't even find which river and which sea you're talking about on a map. A lot of ignorant young people just rooting for what they see as the underdog. But because of Iran's attack on Israel, the analogy doesn't fit. Iran's a much bigger nation, firing huge ballistic missiles at Israel. And now, hopefully the world starts seeing as Israel again as the David against a Goliath. But I want to bring Simon in. And Simon, we'll talk about the Israel-Iran formula and what's happened over the past week. But first, let's talk about here in the UK. Are there protests on the campuses? I think a lot of the universities here were already taken over by liberal, the radical left and Muslim money long ago.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, we also, when it comes to our universities, have to understand the decades of Middle Eastern Arab states' investment into our academic institutions that have really, I think we're now bearing fruit the consequences, particularly when we see the hatred against Israel, the hatred against the Jewish people on campus. And my heart goes out to Jewish students in this country attending our universities, because it's a very threatening place to be Jewish now, especially after the horrific events of October the 7th. So to be a Jewish student in this country is not easy. It was bad when I was at university in the mid-90s, but now it's almost unbearable as Jewish people come face to face with Jew hatred, very much fueled, as you said, from the hard left, and also for the Islamists who are using the war against Hamas in Gaza as a pretext to flex their political muscles, and also an opportunity then to Islamize and put their Islamist agenda in place. So yeah, it's a scary time to be a student, and my heart goes out to the Jewish students in Columbia, in New York, to think that they can't even attend university without fear of attack, that the university has had to close the university down and carry out their lectures online. I mean, we're living unprecedented times.
Mm.
That's for sure.
How are you experiencing this wave of anti-Semitism? I mean, the ripples are going all over the world. It's global, but I think the UK has been. It's happened before, but this is absolutely persistent and emboldened like never before. It seems on the streets of London and elsewhere.
Absolutely. So in February of 2024, only a couple of months ago, an organization, a Jewish organization called the Community Security Trust that provides the security and the protection for the Jewish community, they produced an annual report on recorded incidences of anti-Semitism here in the UK. And their figures are frightening. I mean, we're talking about a 500% increase in reported instances of anti-Semitism, which has skyrocketed. And ever since October the 7th, we've seen that the Jewish community now is extremely fearful, and because of the big mass pro-Palestinian marches that are taking place every Saturday in central London in the Westminster area, that Jewish people feel that that's now a Jew-free zone, that they are too frightened to go into central London because of attacks. So there's a huge amounts of anxiety, huge amounts of fear amongst our Jewish community. There isn't a day that doesn't go past when we see headlines referring to reported instances of anti-Semitism in this country. And now what we're finding is that the Islamists and the hard left are now actually threatening our very democracy itself. I mean, there's intimidation against pro-Israel members of parliament, threats on members of parliament, threats to the Houses of Commons, and our democracy is under threat because we are failing to stand up to the to confront the Jew hatred. Our police now force, the Metropolitan Police Force, seems to be compliant with the Islamist and observing every one of their wishes, whilst arresting pro-Israel demonstrators. One particular Iranian at one of these pro-Palestinian demonstrators actually had a flag saying that Hamas are terrorists, and he was arrested for breaching the peace. And then only last weekend we had Gideon Folter, who heads up an organization called it's called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. After
Like a one-man campaign.
Oh, yeah, very much a one-man campaign. So what he did is that he went to a shul or synagogue in central London on Saturday. He tried to walk across where the Palestinian protests were because he was visibly Jewish by wearing a kippah on his head. And the crowd was shouting out scum. They called him Nazi. And then he was stopped by a police officer telling him that he can't walk across the road. This was all filmed on camera. And that if he did so, he would be breaching the peace, and that he would be arrested because he is visibly seen as Jewish, and that would be provocative. I mean, you can't write the script here, sadly, to the extent that our police force is bowing to the mob, instead of arresting these hate marchers with their incitement to genocide, calling for the destruction of Israel through that very famous phrase that was it, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We've even had that broadcast in lights on the House of Commons only a couple of months ago.
And on Big Ben.
On Big Ben, exactly. So, you know, it's like our nation is cowering to the Islamists, and they are using the Israel cause or Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza as a rallying call to mobilize for political action. So, yeah, we are seeing the direct impact of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza here. Unfortunately, we've had David Cameron parachuted in to become our new foreign secretary, which hasn't helped matters because he's constantly calling for a two-state solution. He's constantly calling for a ceasefire. And with Israel's recent surviving a recent attack from the unprecedented Iranian missile attack on Israel, he said Israel should take the win. And we have to see that this was a declaration of war by the Iranian regime. So our politics, unfortunately, and our government's ability to stand with Israel is certainly being weakened by the rise of the Islamists and the far left, particularly this very important year, because we have a general election coming up sometime before the end of the year. And it looks like the Conservatives will be out of power. And the great danger is that the Labour Party will win. even though that they have a kind of so-called moderate leader in Sir Keir Starmer, who is married to a Jewish woman. He is pro-Israel to a certain extent, but he doesn't know his own mind. All it needs is for one major crisis to hit his premiership, and we could see a coup in which the hard left and the Islamists could take over the Labour Party, and then they would take over the institutions of government. So, yeah, we're living in scary times here in the UK from what was once the bastion of democracy. Our parliament was the mother of parliaments. We have the Magna Carta in this country, and at this current time, our very liberties and our very freedoms are being threatened.
Mm-hmm. You have a similar process in the U.S. where the radical left wing of the Democratic Party, polls show half the Democrats are anti-Israel. Here you have Jeremy Corbyn. George Galloway is back as an MP. He's very anti-Semitic, and if Labor comes back into power here, that's very chilling for Israel.
No, absolutely. But thankfully, we see that George Galloway might lose his seat come the general election, whenever that is. In terms of Jeremy Corbyn, he's no longer a member of the Labour Party. He was kicked out. But there are still Labour MPs who represent the Islamic Muslim communities, and we know that the whole issue to do with Israel, the whole issue to do with the Palestinians, is a rallying cause for them. This is something that they want to flex their political muscle on, because they know that this issue will galvanize and unite their community. And this election coming up, they will want to show that they are a credible, powerful force to be reckoned with. As there was a recent an opinion poll or a survey carried out by Muslim Attitudes, and you found that most of those that were polled actually didn't think that Hamas committed the horrific massacre on October the 7th, and essentially don't believe Israel's narrative that Israel was attacked, that Israeli women were murdered and raped and mutilated, and the crimes that we saw on October the 7th they deny. Plus, there's also 32%, I believe, wanting to bring in Sharia law into this country. So yeah, it's a very dangerous place, and it's especially dangerous to be Jewish right now in this country.
Yeah, if you were to wear, I mean, the guy, it was big news here and all over the world, one single Jewish person with a kippah standing there, and the police told him to leave. They was provoking them, and if the shoe was on the other foot, it shows the double standard, that if you had a Palestinian waving a Palestinian flag near a pro-Israel demonstration, and there have been some large ones here in London, in the UK over the recent months, but they're not every Saturday. But if you show up there with a Palestinian flag, you're not going to get harassed by the police or by anyone. It just shows the difference in the double standard. And if you don't want to provoke or offend Islam, as if, you know, everyone knows they can get violent.
No, absolutely. And back in October, I actually was one of the speakers of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem's London conference. So I left a little bit early. I left at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This was in Westminster. This was in one of the kind of early stages of the big mass protest. I think it was a couple of weeks after October the 7th. So getting off at Westminster, a tube station, which is just outside of Big Ben, walking to the venue, I already saw a whole kind of big police presence and police with guns. And I thought, okay, you know, they are preparing possibly for trouble. And then when I literally walked back after the conference, walking into central London, it was absolutely horrific. It felt, always wondered what it felt like, David, to actually be in Germany in the 1930s at a Nazi Munich, in Munich for a Nazi rally. And I'll tell you what, it felt exactly like that. It felt like you were coming face to face with evil. The hatred on the streets was so profound. You just had a horrific sense that this is absolutely evil, and the chants of genocide were chilling. I mean, I've got a high-profile presence here in the UK, particularly amongst the Jewish community through the programs I do, the kind of Middle East Report, and recently a program that I did with the son of Hamas, Hassan Mossab Youssef, went viral. It's nearly got kind of on the way to 1 million views. And I was a little bit afraid of being recognized, and I felt a prompting of the Holy Spirit to put my hood up as I walked through them. But if any of them had recognized me before, or if I'd worn something that was visibly Jewish, like a skull cap on my head, or a Star of David necklace, I dread to think what would happen to me, to be honest, because there were hardly any police there walking in these crowds. And what was also interesting, that the vast majority of those that were in attendance were Muslims from either an Asian or an Arab background. Not many kind of indigenous white English people were there as well, but literally you could just feel the hate in the streets. I've never come to face with such evil, and this has been happening right through before Israel even launched their ground incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas, that we saw these protests against Israel, and they are just hate-filled. And our former Foreign Secretary, Suella Braverman, who loves Israel, who loves the Jewish community, really wanted to put pressure on Sir Mark Rowland, who's the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Force, to stop these rallies, because they are a breeding ground for incitement to terrorism. They are a breeding ground for Jew hatred and extremism in this country. In no way, in any way, are these peaceful demonstrations. They are just absolutely horrific. So, it's time that our government really got to grips with this, because if they don't, then our whole entire democracy and our freedoms are threatened. And if we don't defend the Jewish people, then sadly what starts with the Jewish people never finishes with the Jewish people. And that's the lesson that we've got to learn from Jew hatred. That's the lesson we've got to learn from the Holocaust and the Second World War. But sadly, our governments are failing to act tough when they need to, in order to protect our Jewish community, but also to protect our freedoms and our democracy, which is under threat, not only here in Britain, but across Europe, and including your native United States of America. The West is in serious peril because we're failing to stand with Israel.
Yeah, just to give everyone a bit of some markers of how much the Arab and Muslim immigrant community and in other ways have really colonized Britain. London is a huge global financial capital, and but the estimates go as high as a quarter of the British economy has been bought up by some of the Arab sovereign oil wealth funds, Arab oil money. Harrods is an example of it, the big department store downtown. And within Britain, it's really startling. There are more Muslims who go to prayer on Friday than there are Christians now who go to church on Sunday. That they're very dedicated to their cause, where a lot of the native Britons are sort of post-Christian now.
No, absolutely, and that's the danger, I think, because if we learn the lessons from the Second World War, it was our Judeo-Christian heritage. It was our belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that literally saved us from Nazi invasion. During the Second World War, key moments in our nation's history, really starting with the fiasco of Dunkirk, when the British Expeditionary Force were in Europe, and we saw the Nazi blitzkrieg when they invaded the Netherlands. They invaded Belgium. They quickly moved into France at lightning speed. Our army was trapped, 360 men, on the beaches of Dunkirk. And this is when we saw divine deliverance on a miraculous scale, primarily because that Hitler had in his sights the British armed forces. They could not escape the beaches of Dunkirk, and had the Nazis overrun our armed forces, that was it. There would be no soldiers left to defend Britain in case of a Nazi invasion. The king took this very seriously at the time. He called for a national day of prayer and repentance, and literally the churches were packed for people coming into the churches to pray and intercede for our nation. what happened then was a miracle, because the head of the German Luftwaffe decided that they shouldn't send in the Panzer tank divisions to destroy the British and French armies, but instead the German Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, would actually carry out the job. So that means it gave the British troops a stay of execution. Then what also happened was that there was a major storm where the Luftwaffe were based in Belgium, so the German Air Force couldn't take off. And then we see also the other miracle that took place is that the sea, the English Channel, was calm, like it hadn't been in decades, which allowed thousands of little boats to rescue our soldiers, and literally 440,000 soldiers were rescued on the beaches of Dunkirk, including my grandfather. And this saved Britain and allowed Britain to fight another day. And if you want to know more, you can watch the incredible film called Dunkirk that came out in 2017. Doesn't show the spiritual aspect of this, but I think the lesson is that when a nation prays and a nation believes in God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in his son, Jesus Christ, he is able to rescue our nation. But our nations now have become so secular, they've become so anti-Christian and so multicultural. If there was such a day of fasting and prayer, we don't even know what God we'd be praying to. So the chances of having deliverance from this country, from the evil forces that we really face in this country, I don't know where our help and our salvation would come from.
Yeah. Look, you can also talk about the Spanish Armada, two different storms that wrecked that mighty, what was it, 200 Spanish fighting galleons. And so
Absolutely.
this nation has known divine protection, and that's a good segue for the rest of our time. Let's talk a little about this exchange of rockets and missiles. Iran fired over 300 drones and cruise and ballistic missiles at Israel. Only a few landed. Most of them shot down before they got to Israeli airspace. 99% kill rate on what Israel and its allies shot down. And then Israel just fires a couple rockets in response, sort of weak. But, first of all, it was really a miracle. You have to say it, with all the advanced weapons, the very fact that Israel is capable of this, when 100 years ago, there was no Jewish fighting force, and now they've leaped to the front of the world as being the proving ground, testing ground of all the advanced weapons. This was pretty amazing.
No, absolutely. And it reminds me of what the current Israeli Prime Minister wrote in his book, Israel, A Place Among the Nations. And he said in the diaspora, the Jewish people were not allowed to own land. They had to be financiers, particularly in Europe in the Middle Ages. So they weren't allowed to own land, so therefore they weren't able to grow produce. And it's only when they returned back to Israel during the first wave of Aliyah, which is in the early 1880s, around 1882, where you had Jewish people from Russia who escaped the pogroms, came to the what was then a province within the Ottoman Empire to establish the kibbutz movement, the communist ideal of an equal society, that they actually then took control of land and bought land. So by owning land, they then became farmers. And from farmers, they became soldiers, really for the first time ever since the Jewish people were back in their land prior to the Roman invasion of Israel back in ancient times. So the fact that Israel is a state and it's been established, and of course with Israel's agricultural growth in communities came the need for protection. And out of that, we've seen the birth of first the Haganah and then the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. So it's incredible now that Israel is leading the world in terms of military technology, in terms of missile defense, and that Israel is also using AI technology more than any other army in order to protect ourselves and look at the threats. And I think the incredible foresight that Israel's military planners have, and knowing which will be the next war, because we know that 2 decades ago Israel faced the suicide bomber, which was absolutely horrific. And that then became placed by the rockets and missiles that we saw fired from Israel, from Gaza, firstly from Hamas when they took over the Gaza Strip in a bloody coup back in 2007. And of course, also we saw that from Hezbollah in 2006. So I think Israel learned a lot during those two conflicts to realize that this is the future. We need to invest in rocket missile defense. So it was an absolute miracle that Israel, together with the Sunni Arab allies such as the Saudis and the Egyptians, backed up by the Americans, the Brits and the French, were able to intercept 99% of those rockets and drones, and also cruise and ballistic missiles from hitting Israel. So absolute miracle. But we also have to thank God that for his divine protection, and shows us what happens when Christians pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that God listens and protects his land and his people.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, there was some statistician and security analyst who said that you had to have, even with complete coordination, perfect communication, training, which you had most of these elements, that to shoot down 90% would have been good, but to take down 99% of what you targeted is a miracle. This is from a professional statistician. It's quite interesting. But there are reports that some of the warheads on these ballistic missiles, they're huge. They're 6 feet in diameter, so you can walk through them like a drain pipe. Huge rocket fuselages. But the warhead, some of them were only 20 or 30 kilos and just did a little dent in the ground. It's quite interesting that if Iran, maybe the distance and all, they couldn't put as heavy a warhead, but the missiles, their ballistic missiles are supposed to be capable of up to, say, 1,000 kilo warhead. That's huge, and this was small.
I think the Iranians were testing Israel's air defense system. I mean, we saw that, didn't we, back in April of 2021, when Hamas fired the unprecedented number of rockets and missiles and projectiles into Israel, which was a real test to see how Israel would respond to that rocket and missile attack back in April of 2021. And we saw, obviously, Hamas deployed the same tactics on October the 7th to disguise their invasion of southern Israel. And we know that the Iranians are the architects of this. So I think they didn't want to cause a huge provocation. I think if there had been a number of casualties that were killed back on the early hours of Sunday, the 14th of April, then it would be a different story. I think Israel would be at war with the Iranian regime by now. And we also saw that Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, gave an interview with Sky News straight after, on the Sunday, the 14th of April, saying that the Iranian attack on Israel was unprecedented. But I also think that Israel's showed what they're capable of doing, and breaching Iranian air defenses, showing how archaic and out of date they are, but did nothing to actually scare the regime. And sadly, in the Middle East, it's all about the perception of strength. And Israel is not perceived as being strong right now. And Israel needs to restore her deterrent capabilities in order for the Jewish state to survive. And the question is that Israel's heading for a war with Iran sooner or later. And it's much better that Israel does that on her terms than wait for the Iranians to get stronger and have a war on Iran's terms. And I think that Israel missed a wonderful opportunity to actually strike back at Iran's nuclear facilities, to actually tell the Iranian regime, you do not mess with us or you'll be hurt. But also we're seeing this incredible weakness on behalf of the Biden administration that's allowing the Iranian regime to go stronger and stronger. And this is the complete failure of the Democrats to understand that American power is based on its military prowess. And that if you don't back up your diplomacy with military power, your words are meaningless. And the Iranians have worked that out. The enemies of the West has worked that out. And this is exactly what we see with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And it's this bizarre notion that peace can be achieved through negotiations, even though they think that by negotiating with a totalitarian regime that wants Israel's destruction, that wants the destruction of the West, wants nuclear weapons in order to bring about the return of the Shia Mahdi or the Messiah, to bring about an apocalypse. They don't believe it. They just think that if you negotiate and you sit down with your enemies, everything can be done through the hands of negotiation, when they've actually forgotten that it's only by the power of military force backing up negotiations, backing up diplomacy, that's where your power lies. And unfortunately, ever since we've seen the Biden occupying the White House, America has not deployed its military power, hasn't backed up its diplomacy with military force. And we've seen that the Biden administration has totally abandoned every single foreign policy that was implemented by the Trump administration. And if we look back to the Trump years, we see that the Middle East was probably in its most stable state it had been in decades. The Iranian regime was on its knees, on the verge of economic collapse. We saw that Hezbollah complaining that they were running out of money. ISIS had actually been defeated in Syria and Iraq, and now, thanks to the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan, we now face another major threat now from ISIS-K based in Afghanistan. So we know that we need a strong American president in power. We need someone who's going to protect Israel and the West, and for America to play the role that God has created America to be, and that's that world superpower, to be a force of good on the world stage, to confront evil like our nations did during the First World War, during the Second World War, during the Cold War. And it's only when we have a strong, robust America, that we have a strong, robust Europe, that we can actually meet the threats that we're currently facing. And that has to come from our Judeo-Christian heritage. And I was reminded recently of reading an incredible quote from a French ambassador to the United States in the 19th century, who said, "What gives America its strength?" And he said, "It's not America's military might. It's not America's industrial might. It's not America's agricultural prowess. But what makes America strong is the power of us preachers in a pulpit. Our nations need to return to God and to understand that we need to again serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not legislate Jesus Christ out of our public square, out of our parliaments, out of our schools, out of our society, because it means that our nations then become vulnerable to a spiritual attack from the enemy. And of course, then our very foundations that are based on our Judeo-Christian heritage are under threat."
Yeah, you're talking about Alexis de Tocqueville, probably the French ambassador. Yeah, he also said America is different because of the pioneering women. They were strong. It was quite interesting how he talked about that as well. Look, I was surprised myself that Israel didn't have a stronger response. And over the last, we're at 200 days of war now. For most of this time, even though the US and other allies were saying, hold back, don't do this, don't do that, the Israeli government, including Gantz in the center, Gallant and Netanyahu, they pressed on with the fight. They were defiant, saying what happened October 7th is unprecedented, and we're going to deal with this. But I think in recent weeks, we've entered a phase where Israel's hands are starting to get tied, and they're losing that defiant spirit that says we're going to fight on. And this response, I don't want to call it weak or lame, but it was a limited response, targeted at just it did send a message where it was like a cruise missile with stealth capabilities, penetrated an S-300 battery, the sort of third generation of Soviet air defenses, or Russian, not quite the S-400, but it took out the control center for an S-300 battery that guards the nuclear facility, the Natanz enrichment plant near Isfahan. So it did send that message that we can reach you, but I think I was surprised, and I think they should have done more. But it has turned the focus back on Iran as the real culprit, the real head of this octopus, these tentacles that go out through Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, all the militias in Iraq and Syria, the pro-Iranian militias there. But the spotlight's on Iran and on its nuclear program. That was helpful. It showed the superiority of Western weapons systems, especially air superiority and the stealth capabilities and some of this. Um, but the Soviet or the Russians, excuse me, I keep talking in Cold War days. I'm an old Cold Warrior, Simon. But the Russian answer is to saturate the air even with more drones, more missiles, and overwhelm your air defenses. And if Iran was serious, as you say, about was sort of even their attack unprecedented, but still limited, given their capabilities. If they had activated Hezbollah to shoot thousands and thousands of rockets, it could have been different. And Israel hardly got scratched. You can consider it a victory, but the response was so limited that you wonder what's going on. How much is are Israel's hands tied now? Of course, Israel can't make the decision alone because it's just not Iran and Israel in this fight. Iran is drawn in to the sphere of fighting the maritime trade routes, Straits of Hormuz, through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, all of this, the Suez Canal. It's all been impacted. And so, Israel has to take that in consideration. I think it was part of it. You mentioned the President Trump, and I think, the real what's really going on behind the scenes. The Biden administration wanted everything anti-Trump except the Abraham Accords. They decided to try and build on the success of that, and that we could have had Saudi Arabia already normalizing relations. It's just that the U.S. insisted on using the talks with the Saudis over this issue to press them to demand of Israel they accept a Palestinian state. I think it was the Americans pushing for it more than the Saudis, and we could have already had a different region before October 7th. And October 7th really was targeting that possibility in a big way. But I don't know what you see as the other fallout from the exchange of 350 rockets and drones and one or two cruise missiles in return.
Well, David, I think it's a race against time to stop the Iranian regime from developing and producing nuclear weapons, because if they have nuclear weapons, it's a game changer. Because the regime knows that once they have and acquire nuclear weapons, and once they have the capabilities to have those ballistic missiles are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, then it changes the whole dynamics of the conflict. The Iranian regime and its fanatical clerics believe that this will protect the regime, because they will not fear any retribution either from the United States or from Israel. So they can continue their vision of creating an Islamic Shia crescent and domination across the Middle East. The danger is that they could then give these kind of nuclear weapon device known as a dirty bomb to their terrorist proxies. And let's not forget that they work with Sunni terrorist organizations, that they work with Hamas. They have cultivated the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And according to the 9/11 Commission, their fingerprints are all over 9/11. And I actually personally believe without the kind of state intelligence needed to carry out attacks on the Twin Towers, then it wouldn't have been possible. You needed that state intelligence apparatus to do that. But we also know that Hezbollah and Al Qaeda leaders met in the mid-90s. And so, Iran is the leading international sponsor of international terrorism. You give that state nuclear weapons, and the whole entire world is in danger. Not just Israel, but the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. And, this is where we need cool heads. This is where we need to understand the danger that we're in. And this is why I believe that sometimes in Israel's early days, Israel developed a policy called the Iron War strategy, where Israel decided to take avertive action in order to protect herself and not worried about what the international community thinks. And sadly, I think Israel's response to the unprecedented Iranian rocket and drone attack on Israel was a missed opportunity to send Tehran a very powerful message. You mess with us, we'll come after you, and we'll come after your nuclear weapons program. But it's also important to remember that when the Iranian regime comes against Israel, they're not coming against the Jewish state. They're coming against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, who is Israel's defense.
Yeah, I don't think God has regathered the Jewish people to the land of Israel for some nuclear holocaust or annihilation. I think they're headed for redemption and great things in God. But I have similar view on really the fallout from this exchange. That Israel is having a policy of containment imposed on it, that the U.S. is content to just try and contain the Iranian threat right now, rather than be assertive and deal with it and roll it back. But it's a revival of that old Cold War policy. And I don't think Israel can afford it with Iran on the nuclear threshold. You're right. 99% is a miracle, but if that one that gets through, that 1% that gets through is a nuclear tipped warhead, you're in trouble. And Israel cannot afford to take that risk. There are people that have been through too much in the Holocaust and all the other tragedies in history. That's our time for today. We want to thank Simon Barrett. He's the host of the Middle East Report, a weekly show on British Christian TV, the Revelation TV here in the UK. I've had a great visit here. Great talking to you, Simon.
Pleasure.
Thanks for being on the show today. That's our time on this episode of the ICEJ webinar series. Make sure to join us next week, 3 p.m. Israel time on Thursday, for the next edition of our webinar series. And at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock Israel time, join us today and every day for our daily global prayer gathering, joining with Christians from around the world to pray for Israel and this region and your own nations. God bless you from London this week.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.
Protests all over the world. Here's a live look at the east side where demonstrators are on the move from the Israeli consulate to the UN.
And Fox 5's Lisa Evers joins us live.
The Israel-Hamas war stoking protests across the U.S. at various college campuses.
We saw posters of Israelis kidnapped by Hamas.
Obama finally retaliated over the weekend for Israel's plan to secret Hamas official by launching a bomb at 60
That's good. This is good. We can understand.
Around the world today is
war in Israel, and here's the latest news from the last